The cold winter wind whipped through Marcus's face as he stepped off the bus in New York City. He had never seen the city like this before. The tall skyscrapers loomed overhead, casting long shadows on the streets below, and the bright lights of Times Square seemed to mock him as he stood there, a stranger in a strange place. He wasn't prepared for this. He had never imagined his life would come to this, a life in pieces, broken by a storm. It all started in Florida. Marcus had a family there, his beautiful wife, Maria, and their 2 kids, Jamal and Aaliyah. They had lived in a modest house by the beach, but that was before the hurricane, before everything was destroyed. The storm had come without warning. At first, it had just seemed like a strong rainstorm, but then it turned into something much worse. By the time Marcus realized how bad it was already too late. The winds howled like a wild animal, knocking over trees, ripping apart rooftops. The rain came in sheets, flooding the streets, and Marcus's home was no match for it. His first priority was to protect his family. He moved quickly, securing the doors, pushing heavy furniture against windows, anything to keep the water out. But as the storm raged on, it became clear that the house wouldn't hold. The water began rising, slowly then faster, until it was waist-high inside. He thought he could save them. He thought they could make it out together, safe. But the floodwaters took everything. His wife, Maria, was swept away, screaming his name as she disappeared into the rushing water. Jamal and Aaliyah tried to hold on to him, but the force of the flood was too much. In the chaos of trying to save them, Marcus lost his grip. When the storm passed, there was nothing left. Everything he had known was gone. His family, his home, his entire life, gone. The guilt weighed heavily on him. Could he have done more? Could he have saved them if he had acted differently? The questions haunted him day and night. With no family left and no home to return to, Marcus felt like he had nothing. The storm had stolen everything, and now he was left with nothing but memories and the pain of loss. It was in the days after the storm, when Marcus was still wandering through the wreckage of his neighborhood, that he made the decision to leave. There was nothing left for him in Florida. He packed what little he had left, a few clothes, some photos of his family, and boarded a bus headed north. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he couldn't stay in the place that had become a reminder of everything he had lost. He ended up in New York, the city of dreams, a place that was supposed to offer new beginnings. But when he arrived, he found that the city was not what he had imagined. The streets were alive with movement, but Marcus felt like an outsider. He had left Florida to escape his pain, but here, in the midst of millions of strangers, he felt just as invisible. Marcus had always believed that New York was a city of opportunity, a place where anyone could start over. But now, standing on the cold streets with no job, no friends, and no family, he realized that he didn't belong here either. The city was full of people, but he felt more alone than ever. The first few days were tough. He couldn't find work. Every job he applied for seemed to slip through his fingers. People looked at him, some with curiosity, others with disdain. His dark skin set him apart, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being judged before he even had a chance to speak. The cold stares and whispered comments made him feel like he didn't belong. He wasn't just a man who had lost everything. He was a stranger in a city that didn't want him. But even though Marcus was fighting his own battle, against grief, against loneliness, against a city that didn't seem to care, he knew he couldn't give up. He had to keep moving forward. Every day was a struggle, but he pushed through. He walked the streets, searching for something, anything, that might give him a sense of purpose. But what he didn't know was that life had one more twist in store for him. One chance meeting would change everything. One cold morning, Marcus sat in a small coffee shop, his fingers wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, trying to stave off the cold and the ache in his chest. His mind wandered back to Florida, to his family, Maria's laughter, Jamal's excitement over his first bike, Aaliyah singing to herself as she played. The memories were all he had left, but they were both comforting and painful, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. As he stared out the window, lost in thought, he heard a voice from the past. "Marcus?" He turned slowly, unsure if he was hearing things. But there, standing in front of him, was a face he recognized. A face he hadn't seen in years. "Jake," Marcus said, his voice shaking. Jake was his childhood friend from Florida. They had grown up together, played football in the streets, shared their dreams of the future. They had been close, but after the storm, Marcus had lost touch with everyone. The devastation had torn people apart in more ways than one. "Man, I can't believe it's really you," Jake said, his face lighting up with surprise. He walked over and embraced Marcus, holding him tightly. "I never thought I'd see you again, man," Jake said, pulling back to look at Marcus. "You look different, but it's really you." The sight of Jake, someone who knew him before everything went wrong, felt like a lifeline. Marcus couldn't believe it. Of all the places in New York, of all the coffee shops in the city, he had run into his old friend. For a moment, the two men just stood there, taking in the unexpected reunion. And then, as they sat down to talk, Jake listened intently as Marcus opened up. He told him about the hurricane, the loss of his family, the struggles he had faced since arriving in New York. Jake's expression grew somber as he heard the pain in Marcus's voice. But there was something else in Jake's eyes, something that made Marcus pause. "You don't know this, but Marcus," Jake said quietly, "you were a hero that day." Marcus blinked, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "I couldn't save them, Jake. I couldn't save my family." Jake shook his head, his voice firm. "No, listen. When the hurricane hit, it wasn't just your family you were trying to save. You were saving everyone else too. You led people to safety. You pulled them from the water. You carried the elderly. You helped the children find their parents. You stayed when everyone else left. You gave everything." For the first time since the storm, Marcus felt something stir inside him, something other than the endless grief that had consumed him. He had saved others. He had done something good, something brave, something that no one had ever told him. He had thought he was just a man who had lost everything. But maybe, just maybe, he was more than that. Jake looked at him with determination. "People need to know what you did. You're not just a survivor. You're a hero." And in that moment, Marcus realized something. Maybe he wasn't invisible. Maybe he wasn't just a man who had lost everything. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and finally let the world see who he really was. The next few days passed in a blur for Marcus. He had always known he was just an ordinary man, but what Jake had said to him, that he was a hero, kept echoing in his mind. At first, it felt impossible. How could he be a hero when he had lost everything? How could he be someone to admire when the people he loved were gone? But Jake's words lingered. "You gave everything. You didn't think about yourself. You risked your life to save others." Marcus couldn't shake the image of the storm, the floodwaters rushing in, people screaming for help. He had fought with everything he had to pull people out, to help those who couldn't save themselves. He hadn't done it for glory, but because it was the right thing to do. Yet, hearing Jake say it aloud made Marcus see it in a new way. Maybe he wasn't just a man who had survived a tragedy. Maybe he had done something meaningful. Jake seemed determined to make sure Marcus understood the gravity of what he had done. "You didn't just save lives that day, Marcus. You saved hope," he had said. "People need to hear your story. They need to know who you are." The thought made Marcus uneasy. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He had always been the quiet type, the one who worked behind the scenes. But maybe Jake was right. Maybe telling his story wasn't just about him. It was about showing others what it meant to rise above tragedy, to fight for others even when everything seemed lost. So, one evening, Jake convinced Marcus to attend a small community meeting, a place where people came together to support one another, to share stories, and to heal. Marcus wasn't sure about it. He had never liked the idea of public speaking, never wanted to stand in front of a crowd and talk about the worst day of his life. But Jake insisted, "You don't have to do it alone, Marcus. We're all in this together. Jake said, his eyes filled with sincerity. As they walked to the community center, Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. The building was small, nestled between two tall apartment blocks. It looked plain, unassuming, but something about it felt like the right place. People gathered there to talk, to share, to find solace in the company of others who understood pain. When they entered the room, everyone turned to look at them. It wasn't a big crowd, but the room was warm, and the people in it all had their own stories of loss and struggle. There were old faces and new faces, each carrying their own burdens. Marcus felt a mix of nervousness and dread. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to be the center of attention, but he also knew that something needed to change. Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but clear. "Everyone, I want you to meet Marcus." A few people nodded in greeting, but most stayed quiet, curious about the new face in the room. Jake continued, his eyes locking with Marcus's. "Marcus isn't just another guy from Florida. He's a hero." When the hurricane hit, Marcus didn't think about himself. He ran into the floodwaters, pulling people to safety, saving lives. But in the process, he lost his family, his wife, his kids. They didn't make it. The room fell silent. Marcus could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, their eyes on him. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he wanted to turn and walk out. It felt too raw, too painful. How could he stand there and talk about his loss, about the storm that had taken everything? But then, something unexpected happened. One woman in the back of the room stood up. She was older, with silver hair and kind eyes. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I remember that day. I remember when the water started rising, when we thought we wouldn't make it. I saw Marcus out there. He wasn't thinking about himself. He was pulling people from the water, helping strangers. He was the one who found me when I thought I was going to drown. He kept telling me, 'Hold on, you're not alone.'" The woman's words hit Marcus hard. He hadn't realized that anyone had noticed him that day. He hadn't realized how much of an impact he had made on people's lives. But as the woman continued to speak, others began to chime in with their own stories. One by one, people in the room stood up, telling Marcus how he had saved them, how his courage had given them hope when everything seemed lost. Tears filled Marcus's eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. For the first time since the hurricane, he felt something other than grief and guilt. He felt proud, not of himself, but of what he had done for others. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about being there when people needed him most. He realized that in helping others survive, he had somehow survived himself. As the night went on, more and more people shared their gratitude. One young man stood up and said, "You don't know this, but you're the reason my mom's alive. You saved her from the flood, and I'll never forget that. You're my hero." Marcus's heart swelled with emotion. The storm had taken so much from him. But tonight, in this small room, he realized he had gained something too. He had found a new sense of belonging. He had found people who understood him. People who saw him not as a man who lost everything, but as the man who gave everything. But just as Marcus was starting to feel the weight of these new connections, there was a sudden shift in the room. The door opened, and in walked a group of people Marcus hadn't seen before. They were dressed in business suits, carrying cameras and microphones. They were from a local news station. "Sorry to interrupt," one of the reporters said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've been following the story of the hurricane heroes, and we heard about you, Marcus. We want to interview you. Tell your story to the city. People need to hear about what you did." Marcus froze. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't want to be on the news. He didn't want the whole world to know what had happened. He was just a man who had lost everything, trying to find a way to live again. Jake leaned in, his voice reassuring. "This is your moment, Marcus. Don't run from it. You're not just some guy anymore. You're a man who gave everything, and people need to know that." The room fell silent as everyone waited for Marcus's response. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. He had never been one for attention, never liked being in the spotlight. But this wasn't about him. This was about the people he had saved, the lives that had been changed because of his actions. After a long pause, Marcus stood up slowly. His hands shook, but his voice was steady when he spoke. I don't want to be a hero. I just did what I had to do. I saved people because that's what you do when there's no one else to help. But if telling my story helps someone else find the strength to do the same, then I'll do it. As the cameras clicked and the microphones were turned on, Marcus finally understood what it meant to be truly seen. It wasn't about the recognition or the applause. It was about knowing that in the midst of his darkest hour, he had made a difference. The next day, the news broadcasted a story across the city. It wasn't just about the man who had survived the hurricane. It was about the man who had saved so many, the man who had given hope when there seemed to be none.